By being present here, you are consenting to be photographed, videotaped, or whatever. So that's required by law to tell everybody that. So I just wanted to let you know. We will begin momentarily. Congressman Crowley will introduce Senator Portman, and then we'll turn it over to Dr. Ngozi. So please relax. There's water on the side. We will get started shortly. Thank you.
Those of you who don't know me, I'm former Congressman Joe Crowley, and I'm presently here and have been for the last 2.5 years at Squire Patton Boggs, Senior Policy Advisor here at Squire Patton Boggs. Very pleased to be here and for this exciting discussion to discuss the World Trade Organization's reform ahead of the 12th Ministerial Conference. And we are tremendously honored to have very special guests, but one in particular, most notably the Director General of the World Trade Organization, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, a pioneering woman at the WTO at a very, very critical and crucial time. We are scheduled to be joined by my former colleague in the House of Representatives and Senator today, Robert Portman from the great state of Ohio. I've known Rob Portman for many, many, many years. In fact, we went way back to my freshman year when he served on, well, there's Rob Portman. Can Rob Portman hear me? I don't know. Now I'm stuck. Let me see. But on the days on the Natural Resources Committee, when I was a freshman member of the House of Representatives, Rob was a bit more senior to me, and we worked very closely on a number of issues, not the least of which was the Underground Railroad legislation that he and my former colleague, Stephanie Tubbs Jones, shepherded through the House, Senate, and into law, a very historic a portion of American history that they have made sure that's embedded in our nation's thoughts. Always a pleasure to be joined by Rob, and he's going to introduce Dr. Ngozi. And with that, I will, if Rob is available, if he's not, and if not, I'm going to also make one other point, that I am so pleased as well to be joined today by Ambassador Susan Schwab, because not only was Rob Portman the ambassador to USTR, but my good friend Susan Schwab was as well. As a Democrat, I worked very closely with both Susan and with Robert when they worked for a Republican administration for then President George W. Bush. I myself had I would say a more remarkable influence in terms of the issue of trade in the House of Representatives. I do say so myself, but in many respects because I got to work with Rob Portman and with Susan Schwab. So Rob, I don't know if you can hear me. Can you hear me, Rob? This technology of today, you think he's on the moon? Are you there, Rob? I'm not sure. Okay.
Oh, he needs to unmute.
Can you unmute, Rob? If you speak, I'll just say what you're saying. I can read your lips. How's that work? So. Joe Crowley is the greatest congressman that was ever. No. I can't read it.
All right, I'm in.
All right, Rob Portman.
Can you hear me? Thank you, my friend. I hope you can hear me okay. I appreciate your nice words there about our time together in the House of Representatives.
Okay.
I enjoy continuing our relationship as well as relationship with your buddy John Boehner from Ohio. And it's good to be with friends from my old law firms. I can say law firms. I'm the only person in the world to have been a lawyer that's involved in at Squire Anders, and now you're one. And Frank Samolis, Val, Susan Schwab, Jennifer Hillman, others. It's great to get the band back together. Jennifer, congrats on getting the Lifetime Achievement Award for Women in Trade recently. And of course, Director General, it's great to be with you again. I was with Director General Okaru-Bisant just a few weeks ago, along with my friend Angela Eller, when they came up to the Hill to talk to us about trade issues and specifically about WTO reform. So I'm excited to be with her again. And look, I'm a very strong supporter of us being active in the WTO. I think it's had a very distinguished history of leading the way on expanding trade opportunities around the world. It's accomplished a lot in the 26 years since it succeeded GATT. International trade has grown about fourfold. So you have to have 164 members.
This is one of those paragraphs that I just say no, but yeah.
Someone should go on mute, it sounds like, maybe.
No, I was like, hang out. Some boring is.
If everyone could go on mute, that would be great. Anyway, I have some concerns about the WTO and how it's operating. And it's sometimes been used as a forum to be able to legitimize some of the anti-trade practices in the world that are growing. And some countries have acted as spoilers to keep other countries from making progress on trade. And that is one of the concerns I have about the WTO. I see three areas that need reform. One is the judicial activism, which I think exists in the appellate body. I think it's continued to weaken the multilateral system. Remember testifying at the Senate Finance Committee 15 years ago, so discussing appellate bodies' overreach on things like drilling, and so these are not new issues. But it needs to be pressed. The WTO members have not been able to negotiate a new trade agreement forever. Susan Schwab is on with me now. She was my deputy and then succeeded me and did a terrific job, much better than me. And she will tell you that I spent many, many hours on Doha trying to get progress. Today, most people on this call don't even remember there was a Doha round. And it was frustrating not to be able to make progress. Finally, both of these issues, the lack of negotiations in the appellate body, I think have helped to create another problem, which is making the WTO less effective in addressing the major challenge, as I see it, which is addressing non-market economies and what the challenges they pose to the multilateral system. So I believe there is a middle ground here where we hold up the WTO for what it is, an important institution that needs to be reformed, and there's bipartisan support in Congress to do that. You may recall a colleague of mine had raised a motion which he was able to take to the floor to pull the United States out of the WTO. In response to that, Senator Ben Cardin and I introduced a bipartisan resolution which reflected our feelings about the WTO. In many respects, some of the issues that I talked about today, making it clear that we value the WTO, but there need to be some concrete reforms to make it operate more effectively. One example that we talk about in our resolution that I've talked to the Director General about is expanding the use of plurilateral agreements without most favored nation requirements to disempower those spoilers we talked about earlier and ensure that only countries party to that trade agreement get the benefit from the agreement. In other words, if 63 countries want to reach agreement on new rules or trade liberalization, I believe that an objection from a single country shouldn't block that agreement forever. And that's only common sense. And that blockage should also result in that country not enjoying benefits of trade that come from that agreement. This would avoid lowest common denominator agreements and would revitalize the WTO's negotiating function. So we have some examples of this where plurilateral agreements have been successful, and I think we should encourage more. Second is to restore the intended meaning to trade remedy provisions that have limited the ability of the United States to crack down on foreign trade cheating. And this comes in the form of our new Leveling the Playing Field Act 2.0. We're trying to encourage more consistent and rapid response when there is a trade violation, and to deal with the issue of country hopping. Third is for us to properly utilize rules against currency manipulation, which I believe should be part of the trade discussion. And finally, we should focus on creating new rules to discipline subsidies and state-owned enterprises, which is critical. I appreciate that Ambassador Catherine Tai, the USTR, and the Biden administration has made reforming the WTO a priority in her diplomatic discussions with our allies. We all will benefit from reforms that create more fairness and more transparency for business and workers. We should be proud of the successes of both the WTO and the system for free global trade that it was designed to protect, but at the same time, the United States leadership in the WTO should not be just to expand trade, but also to take a long look at the shortcomings of the institution that have been made clear over the years. I'm also very excited about what we're doing outside of the WTO in terms of pursuing trade agreements. I'm encouraging the administration to complete the agreement with the United Kingdom, which has made a lot of progress already. The WTO now has the UK as a member, and I think it's important that we pursue that bilateral agreement. Actually, we'll be in the UK in a couple of weeks talking about this issue and working with my colleague Chris Coons in a bipartisan way to move that agreement forward with or without TPA, Trade Promotion Authority. So look, I'm hopeful we can use these conversations as a way to move the debate forward and how to reform the World Trade Organization to reflect the realities, not just of 2021, but also 2031 and 2051 and beyond. Thanks again to Squire, Pat, and Boggs for bringing together this expert discussion, and for everyone in attendance lending their expertise and insights. And there is no expertise more important right now than the Director General herself. So, Director General, I believe you are speaking next, and I was hoping that I could hear from you in person, but I can at least hear from you remotely. So, Director General, Okonjo-Iweala, the floor is yours.
Actually, I think Dr. Okonjo-Iweala was meant to react to, if she wanted to react to your commentary, but she's really here for a fireside chat. I think I sent a message to, we sent a message to Angie, so as you rightly said, she may react or may not, because this is actually a fireside chat. So I appreciate, thank you so much, Senator Potman, for, sort of summarizing what the main issues are. And with that, I'll turn to Dr. Okonjo-Iweala, WTO DG, to react if she wants to, or she may at the end of the fireside chat.
Well, maybe, thank you so much. I'll do that now, and because Senator Portman has raised a number of issues. First, let me just say how happy I am to be here and to see some old and new friends, and many people I've seen on Zoom. It's wonderful to see you in person. And thank you, Val and Frank, for organizing this. It's fantastic. We've been Zooming for a long time. Now we are actually in person. I also appreciate the Honorable Joe Crowley for being here, and Senator Portman. As he said, we met not so long ago with Angela, and many of you were supportive of me when I was campaigning. It's also an honor to be with Ambassador Susan Schwab, whose, I would say, fame goes before her. So thank you so much. I think Senator Portman raised a number of very good points. I first want to thank him for these observations, for the support to the WTO, to say that one is fully cognizant of the fact that the support for the WTO, the bipartisan support, comes with caveats. And those caveats have to do with the issues raised about WTO reform. He raised so many issues with respect to the appellate body and judicial activism, the multilateral lack of negotiating function, and non-market economies, the use of plurilaterals, currency manipulation, level playing field issues. All of these, well, I will not maybe comment on currency issues because from my training, I'm an economist before. I think we better leave that to the IMF and the U.S. Treasury to deal with. But the issues you've mentioned about our functions, first we need to strengthen our monitoring function and notification function. I think this is a very important one that is there to encourage transparency in the dealings of members, and this is one of the very, very useful functions. I'll talk about it later, that the WTO has, that is actually being deployed now in a very good way. We also, you talked about the negotiating functions. I agree. The WTO has not been able to complete a multilateral negotiations for 21 years. And I really want us to think about this, because one of the reasons that I was interested when I was nominated for this job is when I looked at the Marrakesh Preamble, which said that the purpose of the WTO purpose of the WTO is to enhance living standards, to help create employment, and to support sustainable development. This purpose is as valid now as it was then in 1994-95 when this was put together. And so this is a very attractive thing. And if this is what the WTO is about, to me it was all about people. The WTO is about people. So the question I ask myself, why, if you're working for people, would it take you 20 years to negotiate any agreement? Why would you want to take so long over fisheries when there are millions of fisherwomen and men whose livelihoods depend on it? Why, when our planet requires the biodiversity of our oceans, agriculture, there are so many small and big holders, but this is taking years. So I totally agree, and I'm still at a loss. And all I can tell you now, I love trade lawyers, so I don't mean to say anything against them, but I think that the WTO has turned into a negotiating forum for trade lawyers, and somewhere along the way, we lost the purpose for these negotiations. That's all I can say. And so my real objective and ambition and passion is to bring the WTO back to what it's supposed to do, to be about people, to deliver for people. And that is why I think this issue of completing a multilateral negotiations is very important, to show the WTO can do it and can deliver for people. This is what lies behind the push to at least complete the fishery subsidies negotiations. On the level playing field issues, yes, it is true that perhaps some of the subsidies and countervailing measures agreement that was made 25 years ago may need an update. Does it still catch the evolution of the economies and what is happening? Should we look at those rules and whether they capture what the dynamism of what is happening in today's economies? I think so. I think we need to look at that. And I want to assure Senator Portman that we have launched a study on competitive neutrality issues jointly with the World Bank, the IMF, and the OECD. And so there's this study that is looking at both industrial subsidies and agricultural subsidies and subsidies that may even arise from the fiscal stimulus and the accommodative monetary policies that we've had now that may be lingering. We also need to think about that. So we are looking at all these issues of subsidies that distort competition, distort market signals. And in addition to that, we're deepening this at the WTO by looking a bit more deeply into the issues of level playing field. And I'm happy to say that DDG Annabel Gonzalez is leading that work with our chief economist, Bob Koopman, who is not here. So we are not staying idle on this issue. We're very, very active. And on the issue of the appellate body and dispute settlement system, it's also true that, look, if you're a rule-making organization and you want to make new rules, having your dispute resolution system disabled is not a very good sign. But Mark, it's not completely paralyzed. We have the first level, the panel, which is still going on, and we've had about 8 cases or appeals or whatever you want to term them already this year. So it's still, that level is working, but it means people can appeal any judgment that comes into the void because the second tier is not working. So the issues that have been raised by Senator Portman and by the U.S. over several administrations have some validity in them. Perhaps it's taking too long to complete a look at these issues that are brought before the panel. Instead of 90 days, it now takes years, maybe because they are more complex. Perhaps there's judicial activism, like Senator Portman said. Let me also say developing countries have some issues. They find the system not very accessible, very complicated for them to use. So I think there's room for us to really look at what is happening, have an honest conversation, as Ambassador Tai would say, on what we need to do in order to reform this. And I'm very hopeful that at MC12, we will begin to have this conversation to put together a process by which we can do work on this particular reform, hopefully before MC13. So I think lastly is the issue of plurilaterals. Well, people forget that the GATT, the WTO, there's been use of instruments quite flexibly. So there's the multilateral negotiations, which are by far and away the preferred one. But like Senator Portman mentioned, there's also been use of plurilaterals very successfully. The information technology agreement that he mentioned, which has been renewed once, covering many more goods, now covers 97% of goods in the telecommunications, computer, information technology area. And this is really, really a very popular and very successful plurilateral agreement. I've listened to business people in these sectors who have said this is one of the best things that we've done. So if we can have such a successful agreement as the ITA, we use the instrument to tackle issues that are arising now in our economy as it involves digital. E-commerce, we have e-commerce negotiations being done by about 86 members to tackle the digital economic issues. Services is it. Services trade is growing in leaps and bounds. We have the services domestic regulation plurilateral that is ongoing. Investment facilitation. We have emerging ones in the area of climate and environment, and also what I really love about inclusion. How do we use trade as an instrument to bring those who have been marginalized in women and trade, MISMEs, micro, medium, and small enterprises? So there's versatility in these instruments, and I think we should be able to be flexible to use these alongside the multilaterals. Let me stop there.
Great.
Thank you so much, WTO DG Dr. Ngozi. And with that, I want to pass on to Ambassador Susan Schwab, who's going to engage you in a conversation.
Thank you, Val. Thank you, Senator Portman and my favorite Congressman Crowley. It was a pleasure. It was a pleasure working with you, and we need to see more of that bipartisanship in this country. It is a joy to see you here, Madam Director General, and you've anticipated some of my questions, but I will say at the outset, your candor and your commentary is refreshing, and the fact that you're not a lawyer is also, sorry, Sanders, Squire, Sanders, Patton, anyway, also refreshing. So I'm going to continue along the lines of some of the things, I'm going to build on some of the things that you've said. When you are introduced, inevitably, people go through a list of the firsts that you represent, right? You represent many firsts at the WTO, many impressive firsts. And I would like you, after 7 months in office, thinking about some of the unique firsts that you bring to the table, not just being the first woman DG, not just being the first African, but coming from an economist perspective, a finance perspective, a World Bank experience, a different skill set in many ways. What are some of the tools and skills and experiences that you've had in the past that you can already see with a little bit of detachment are going to help you in this unique enterprise we call the WTO? Because it is a unique multilateral institution with, as you've noted, unique issues.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Schwab, for that and for your compliments. I think the WTO is indeed unique. I think it's one of the most interesting organizations, and as well as the most challenging. And when people say congratulations, I say, well, it may be commiserations, but we'll see. But the point I want to make is the job is really interesting. I still want to I wake up in the morning still rushing to get to the office. And as long as that is happening, I think it's an exciting job. So it's 7 months now. Sometimes I joke it feels like 7 years because so much has happened. But I feel exceedingly blessed because one of the key skills that I bring, and maybe this is what helped me be selected, is the fact that I know something about vaccines. I've been chair of the Global Vaccine Alliance, Gavi, for 5 years, chair of the board, and learned a lot about this. And I came into this job at a time when that knowledge is very valuable. And so it's helped me to look at the issues of trade and health and to think about how can the WTO, how can trade be part of the solution to this pandemic? What can we do that can contribute? You know, we're in a world where people now, trade has almost become not a good word. You see so many people looking at trade, it's all about enriching corporations. It's, people have forgotten that trade lifted 1 billion people out of poverty, that trade can do so again. And so having the opportunity to see what we can do when people are dying in the pandemic, those skills really help. So about vaccines, we were able to look and see, what can we do? We have this issue that we're not producing enough vaccines. The world, we could produce about 5 billion doses of vaccines, mostly for children. And Gavi was the biggest buyer of these vaccines, 60% of children's vaccines in the world. That's the capacity we had. And then we have to produce 10 billion and now maybe 15 billion doses. We just didn't have that scale. So reaching out and talking to manufacturers, which was something we did, of pharmaceuticals, and saying to them, how can we work with you from the WTO side to look at your issues and see how we can help you scale up production and even decentralize production from there are 10 countries that export 80% of our vaccines in the world. Very concentrated. How can we work with you to get you to invest in emerging markets and developing countries? So I'm very proud of the work that the staff in the Secretariat have been doing in monitoring supply chains and looking at what we can do with trade facilitation, looking at very granular work of what are the bottlenecks that these companies are facing. So, and the issue of IP, for instance, is very, as you know, very difficult one. More than 100 countries asking for waiver of IP and trying to bring members on both sides of this equation together to try and look for a pragmatic solution based on what I know. That has really been a use of the knowledge and gifts. Of course, I'll quickly say negotiating gifts. I'm not a trade negotiator, but I've been able as finance minister to negotiate with the Paris Club, to negotiate away $30 billion in debt for my country. And I say to people that negotiations, this is a fine art. And if you just permit me to use an analogy that I used in the General Council one day, when I look at negotiations in Geneva, I said, look, when you're about 8 or 9 years old, when I was 8 or 9, I started following my grandmother and my mother to the market at home. They take you to the market because you have to start learning the fine art of negotiating in the market. And it's a fine art. You know, the person selling you a product knows just how far to go in terms of what they are demanding. And you know just how far to go in terms of what you're offering. If they step a little bit too much this way, they know you will lose interest and walk away. If you offer something too low, they will also just turn their back on you. So learning how to negotiate, what I'm seeing at the WTO is sometimes that fine art of negotiations is not in play. Because there are people who take very extreme positions that make other people just walk away. And there are people who offer something that are impossible or almost impossible to deal with under the circumstances that make other people turn their backs. So we have to, if we are going to negotiate, we have to come to that situation where we know just how far we go without turning other members off, know just what we offer without making other members think, look, you're not taking these negotiations seriously. So that fine art, I think, has been a little bit lost due to history, due to mistrust. There's tremendous mistrust among members. There's a lot of history about the Doha round that was not completed, and there are members who still feel very sore that development issues are not paid attention to, and this breeds a lot of distrust. We have to bring these things together. We have to bring members together. We have to look at these issues. I feel they can be dealt with. And that is, in fact, it's such a challenge, but it's also quite exciting to say, how are we going to bring members together and build this trust that is missing? So those are two skills. I won't go on and on. There are others. Of course, there are many skills that I lack.
Those are two very important ones, and I look forward to having a chat about the Doha round over a beer one day. But yeah.
Over margarita.
Ooh, I'll take it. I'll take it. That sounds great. Thank you very, very much. Let me turn the microphone over to Dr. Val Okaru-Bisant.
That's right.
As
You
our-
can call me Val.
Let me turn the.
That's right. I know we want to be formal. But,
Thank you very much.
yes, thank you so much, Dr. Ngozi, for. I know. I call you Ngozi elsewhere, but this is a formal event. I know I just did that to Ambassador Suzanne, but I know. Yes. I just want to say, before my question, which is linked to the IP issue you raised, I just want to give a little background because you've been very humble about what you've done. So I wrote it down just to be very articulate. I want to congratulate you. I know I did privately, but I want to make it known for taking on the helms of the organization at a time of its pains and global trade and health crisis. As you mentioned earlier, it was just the right time. You're the opportune leader because you've already had exposure to Gavi. You worked as an SME owner. You also worked in the multilateral. You were a leader, number 2 at the World Bank. Okay, so that's not just, you don't have to be apologetic about that. You have the relevant leadership skills, sound credibility, and integrity to help WTO to meet the current and future demands of its member nations in health, trade, SME, and beyond. And I want to also say kudos to you and the WTO and WHO for partnering with other organizations to lead COVAX. Okay, because when we talk about statistics globally, there are 219 million reported cases of COVID currently. 4.5, this is the last time I checked, so nobody should hold me accountable for statistics here, but of those, we have 4.5 million deaths so far. But undoubtedly, COVAX has been instrumental in slowing down the negative impacts on, COVID on human life and also on food, medical supply chain, right? And let me also say we live in a very interconnected world. They say that when somebody sneezes in any part of the world, the rest of the world will catch it. Why? Because of technological advancement. We're sort of one world now. So we're somewhat, I don't want to quote the Bible, but we are our brother's keeper. We're not going back to Cain and Abel era, but really we're being forced now or goaded to be our brother's keeper. So within that framework, I know that we have challenges going on right now with, I'm not going to mention countries, but some countries have actually imposed stringent vaccine measures, nationalism measures. There are some who have restrictions, but for a specific time frame. And I know that under your leadership, WTO is encouraging freer flow of medical supplies, including expansion of your voluntary monitoring system, okay, to encourage member states to adopt a transparent system, right? So beyond urging members to lift export restrictions and to avoid nationalism, I'm very much interested in knowing, you called on the third way, in quote, right, on the TRIPS, to expand manufacturing to COVID vaccines in developing countries. Because right now we have, in terms of statistics, less than 7 African countries have vaccine manufacturers, and those manufacturers have very limited upstream production with inadequate export capacity. So my question really is this, and I know we are in a forum of, I know the ambassador, we have the ambassador of Cameroon here, but we're also in a forum of mostly U.S. trade lawyers and policy makers and implementers. So there's actually a link to that too. So my question is, what is the status of WTO reform measures to use the third way on the TRIPS to encourage the free flow of medical and food supply chain, especially the medical side of things, to expand access to medical supplies in poor countries? And within that framework, I actually have a related question. There are those who, believe in promoting absolute, I use the word absolute, full IP protection to manufacturers and inventors. And there are those on the other side who believe in waiver of, like we know that I think it was in May 2021, just not too long ago, the Biden administration announced a waiver of IP rights to facilitate global access to US manufactured COVID vaccines. So please, how far has the WTO gone so far with the third way in terms of reforms? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Val. There are a lot of things packed into your question. So first, I want to talk about trade and what it has contributed during this pandemic. Then you mentioned the issue of the third way and the IP waiver. People don't know, but trade has been very instrumental in terms of being part of the solution to the pandemic. Last year, even as the value of trade shrunk by almost 8%, the value of trade in medical products increased by 16%, the value of trade in personal protective equipment by 50%, and in face masks that we are all wearing by 480%. So what am I trying to say? Those trade, because of the multilateral trading system that we have, we were able to move goods around. After the initial disruptions that we saw, we were able to move goods around from places, medical supplies and countermeasures, from places where they were to places where they were needed. And I think that that is something we kind of take for granted. But think about it. If we didn't have this trading system, we wouldn't have been able to get some of these products where they are needed. So I just want people to know that we just made our trade forecast. Trade this year is going to increase merchandise trade volume by 10.8%. this year, 4.7% next year. And trade has rebounded so strongly. But we shouldn't be complacent because there's a divergence in the rebound. It's a K-shaped trade recovery, like the recovery in output. There are some who are on the upper slope of this K-shape, and those are, you know, people in rich countries that have been able, developed countries mostly, and some emerging markets that have been able to issue or implement a very strong fiscal stimulus and accommodative monetary policy and have access to vaccines. Those that and this is, so you have Europe, you have North America, you have Asia, who are, you know, on the upper part of this rebound. And then you have South America, you have Africa, you have Middle East, who are on the downward part of this rebound. And what is the determining factor? They haven't been able to have the fiscal space to implement large amounts of stimulus. At the same time, no access to vaccines have been limited. So we've actually seen that access to vaccines has a direct link to trade recovery. That's why I keep saying that vaccine policy is trade policy, and trade policy is vaccine policy. Until we can solve this problem that is morally, practically, and economically wrong of inequity of access, we are not going to have these other parts of the world rebound, which means that our recovery in the rich parts is also not sustainable. So, so whilst we are rejoicing at the strong rebound, in spite of all the problems we see with supply chains now snarled, is actually because of the rebound. Demand side pressures are there. We should also be cognizant of the fact that there are parts of the world that where this rebound is not working. So now let me take the latter part of your question on the issue of access to vaccines, increasing production, scaling up on the IP. I think I wrote this article in Foreign Affairs about, and I put this word, the third way, not knowing that it was going to get a life of its own. What I was, which is good in a way, what I was trying to say is looking very practically at the issues we faced in terms of access to vaccines and other medical countermeasures. And I was seeing this evolving debate in IP and thinking in my mind that people are dying, and typically things take time at the WTO. I don't know how long this debate. We better look for other ways that we can work to scale up vaccine production and access. And that's why I started advocating that there must be a third way to move things whilst we try to sort out the IP issues. And that third way was to look at what is the gap in manufacturing? How do we help solve this? How do we scale up production of vaccines and other medical products? So this third way, it was really focused at increasing production, scaling it up, decentralizing it to parts of the world that don't have, and encouraging voluntary licensing to make that happen. Again, whilst we are waiting for IP issues to sort themselves out. I think initially there was companies, many of the vaccine manufacturing companies felt that there were not enough sites in the world where they could, outside of the developed countries, where they could scale up production. And they were working in the rich countries to try and do that. But you've seen what happened with vaccine nationalism. When push comes to shove, politics trumps all, because a politician will not want to be seen to be exporting vaccines, for instance, when people are dying in their own country or when there's a spike. That's why we have to decentralize production so that the world can be more resilient. And so part of that third way is working with these companies and saying, let us find areas and places where you can indeed set up shop to manufacture or use existing capacity, repurpose it, for instance. And then we found that there were several places where we could do this. I'm really proud to say that with very hard work on the part of many, we are not claiming all the credit, but a little bit of credit to the WTO in reaching out, we've been able to see Pfizer-BioNTech announce an investment in South Africa with BioVac. We've seen J&J also announce work with Aspen. We have seen Moderna now announcing an investment in Africa. They're still searching for which site. So this thing has had an impact. And so pushing that third way with the voluntary licensing, I think, is part of the answer. And the technology transfer that goes with it. Now, the IP waiver, several countries, members have felt that the TRIPS agreement, which governs patent rights, has not been very easy to use. The compulsory licensing provisions there have been very difficult. And so they thought that with the best way is to waive completely the patent protection so that those who want to manufacture can have the rights and be able to do that. Now, as you said, Val, there are members on the other side who feel that, look, if we do this, we were very fortunate that miraculously, science and research led to an incredible speed in producing these vaccines, and that if you do this and waive the protections, that might disincentivize this kind of innovation. So you have those two sides, and I think, you know, if you think about it, there are points to be made on both sides. But the issue is, how then do we get to a practical solution? You can understand why developing countries want to have this waiver, because during the time of HIV/AIDS, the years ago, we had to wait. Developing countries had to wait in the queue. They couldn't afford the drugs for a long time, and many people died. So you can understand the sentiment. How do we honor this issue of getting access to poorer countries faster, to know-how and technology transfer, and at the same time not disincentivize research and innovation? I think there's a medium ground. I can see it before my eyes, but I'm not a member. But I think members can come to this solution. It's there. And if they work hard enough, they can reach it. I'm happy to say that, look, though the formal negotiations are not moving too well in the TRIPS Council, recently there's been some movement, coming out of informal consultations between some of the members, and I hope that it will move in that direction so that by MC12 we could come out with a solution. I do not think we can go to MC12 talking about solutions to the pandemic and a ministerial declaration without having a solution on the IP issue.
Thank you so much for that. And I have one question, and I think the MC12 is going to be handled by Frank, but I have a related question which is very critical to what you've just said. I really appreciate your mentioning PEPFAR, and I think that was under George W. Bush, and he did quite an awesome job with that. And I'm sure, you know, everybody would agree. And of course, President Obama and the, you know, other presidents that followed, you know, suit, you know, complied, and they adopted it, and it was, I think it's also been renegotiated, and it's been approved, and it's currently being used right now. Provided access to HIV/AIDS drugs in South Africa and beyond in terms of generic drugs. So that's probably a way that we could probably borrow some lessons from that and apply it to what's going on right now with COVID. But quickly on the second question, the status of the July 2021 $50 billion proposal of the Multilateral Trade, Health and Finance Task Force concerning facilitating public-private interventions. Please, what's the status now in terms of delivery of medical supplies to developing countries? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Val. That's actually a very good question. What has happened is that the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, did an excellent study in which they showed that if we spend $50 billion now and to vaccinate 40% of the world by end of this year, initially it was 60% by mid next year. Now WHO upped the target to 70%. We could really have a sustainable recovery. And what happened is that we got together as heads of international institutions to back this IMF study and the recommendations. Just think about it. We've spent in fiscal stimulus, rich countries and emerging markets have spent almost $26 trillion and counting, because we didn't pay attention to prevention. But if we spend 50 billion now, we can save so much. And if we spend some more money, I'll come back to it, to prepare better for next time, then we wouldn't have to spend trillions. So what we did is the heads of the four international organizations, the IMF, the World Bank, the WHO, and the WTO, we got together and said, let us band together, put our forces together to try and push for implementation of these recommendations in terms of getting the resources, trying to work with manufacturers, which the WTO was already doing, to find out what's happening with their production schedules, with the contracts. How can we get more transparency in which countries are bidding for which contracts, because sometimes poor countries come in at the end of the queue and have to pay even higher prices. What about distribution? The production we have now, where is it going and how is it being distributed in country? Are there problems, and how do we get the resources to those countries so that we can take care of distribution problems? Because it's not just making the vaccines, it's also getting it into arms. And in some countries, you of course have logistics, cold chains, and other issues you need to think about. So we've been working together. We've been working with the manufacturers. The IMF has been trying to monitor how much resources is going in from itself, from the World Bank, from donors, watching how much is also going to COVAX, so that can go to the 92 poor countries that COVAX is designed to help. And we will continue. This effort is ongoing. We have a second level of our colleagues, Annabelle is here, who are actually doing the day-to-day follow-up on this to get the information we need so we know where we are. So that work is ongoing, and we will continue it until we are satisfied that the issue of inequity of access is being tackled successfully.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ngozi, for a very succinct and wonderful, useful answer to our questions. And with that, I want to pass on to Frank.
Great. Thank you, Val. And thank you, Dr. Ngozi, for being here. Thank you, Susan, Val, Joe, and Senator Portman. I should mention we have about 100 people attending this virtually. And I just wanted to mention some of them who are participating. Rodney Slater, former Secretary of Transportation in the Clinton administration, Ambassador Fraser from the Hoover Institute, and my colleague, Ambassador Frank Wisner, who is career ambassador. He served as ambassador to India, the Philippines, and to Egypt, a very illustrious career. And I will be very brief. You touched upon a lot of the issues relating to the MC12. My question is, and I'm sure you've been asked this before, what would you consider to be a successful outcome at the end of the MC12?
Well, thank you very much, Frank, for that question. I think, for me, a successful MC12 will be one that delivers at least one or two of the outcomes that we've been talking about that work for people. So if we have and then makes progress on others. So let me explain myself. I've always said since I came that we have a large number of issues that they are being worked on by WTO members. to have success at MC12, we should focus very carefully. We can't deliver everything. So if we could focus on, you know, an outcome in one or two areas and substantial progress in others, I think that would be a mark of success. So we could look at trade and health. What can we come up with respect to a ministerial decision or declaration that shows what we're willing to do in this pandemic to help solve it? And I've already mentioned several areas we could really capture that members can act and have been acting on: trade facilitation, on limiting restrictions, on supply chain issues, etc. How do we capture that on technology transfer? If we can get a strong declaration about trade and WTO rules as a solution to this pandemic, but also preparing us for the next one, that could be a good outcome where we are really working for people. If we are able to conclude the fisheries subsidies negotiations, fantastic. We've been trying for 20 years. I hope we don't do for another 20 years. If we concluded that, that would be a good outcome. If we could get some basic understandings and package in agriculture. Agriculture is very contentious. I didn't talk about it before because there are long-standing issues. We have issues of agricultural subsidies, which are ballooning at the moment. Any number at present is said any number from about 540 to 700 billion is what we're looking at in subsidies, and could reach more than $1 trillion by 2030. And this is, of course, distorting market signals and distorting competition and so on. So how do we solve this? Is part of the negotiations. Issues of food security. We've seen during this pandemic that food security is also part of the issues we're facing, and inflation in food prices. And there are countries that are very keen to have a solution, permanent solution to public stockholding. So, but these issues are also very contentious. I'm just mentioning two of them. There are several others: waiver of WFP, humanitarian purchases, transparency issues in shipments, the whole range. If we could get somewhere with some basic approach on the food security issue, on transparency, on WFP waiver, and then perhaps on domestic support, we could have some kind of approach that we would lay out. That would be good. So I think agriculture is quite difficult to say that we would have an outcome, but some progress there would be very good. And then we have on the dispute settlement that many have raised. I've already said, if we could at MC12 be able to talk about a process that we could put in place to get us to working on this. So I'm not expecting any outcome at MC12. We're not there at all. How do we initiate a process at MC12 that starts work post MC12 on this issue? I think that would be part of the success. And then, as I said, the whole range of really exciting issues that are being worked on now. We mentioned digital, the digital economy and the e-commerce. If we can make progress on e-payments, spam, issues like that, move along some of those agreements on the digital trade, that would be good. We don't expect it to be completed. Services domestic regulation, where we think we're making excellent progress. If we could deliver that for MC12, that would be good. Some progress on inclusion, on MISMIs and women seems possible, and also on issues of climate and environment. So those ones, I'm listing things, but on those I expect progress, not conclusion. So some mixture of one or two things concluded with others that are making progress, I think would make for success.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Ngozi.
Thank you so much for your response to Frank. And with that, we pass on to Honorable Joe Crowley.
Well, once again, thank you, Dr. Ngozi, for being here today. I think one takeaway for me in terms of this discussion is that with the calls for reform, and I'm sure if reform is correct, with modernization maybe of the WTO, especially during this pandemic, as you point out as well. It's a yeoman's task. It's not an easy task at all, coming up to the 12th MC. But for the health of our world economy, they need to be addressed. That's the first point I take from it. Secondly, and maybe more important, that Dr. Ngozi, you in this position are the right person at the right time, coming from Africa, the inspiration that you are to girls and women, not just from Africa, but from around the world, taking on these responsibilities for mankind and for all of us. I say it's enormous, and I'm deeply appreciative of your sacrifice to do this as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Wow, I feel so honored, Honorable Joe Crowley, for that. It's an honor and a privilege to be able to be in this position. People say I'm the right person at the right time. I hope so. All I can tell you is I will work as hard as I can. And you can see I'm excited about the job. I'm enthusiastic about it. I'm passionate. You know, tough as it might be, I have a wonderful team around me. Some of them are here. We have Mark, we have Annabelle, we have Nicole. And back in the Secretariat, there's so many good staff who are working their hearts out, trying to deliver. So it's an honor for me to be one of them and to try and lead them to get this result. The members, you know, we have ambassadors who are sacrificing so much. They're not paid anything. You have Ambassador Santiago Wills leading the fisheries, Ambassador Gloria Peralta leading agriculture. You have other ambassadors, I could name all of, who are working, Ambassador Walker, David Walker, looking at trade and health issues. Doug Finsoli, who is leading the IP discussions. There are ambassadors who are working really hard, and I want to honor all of them. So it's not just about me. I'm in the back trying to help and push, but there are really members and staff who are working very hard, and it's an absolute honor to be with them. Sometimes, you know, maybe I'm impatient a little bit. You know, I'm pushing hard to get things done. I'm feeling we're too slow. That's because I'm thinking of, why are we wasting so much time when we have people to look after, when we have the planet and sustainability issues to deal with? The other day, the Secretary General of the United Nations sent a letter to leaders asking them to urge trade ministers to conclude fisheries subsidies. So that really also gave me a push. And I'm very grateful. I've had several meetings with trade ministers, even leaders. We just came from the G20 trade ministers in Sorrento, and many of them were enthusiastic to try and get things done. Does that mean that there are no more difficulties and it's not? No. You still have differences among members in fisheries. You still have this IP waiver issue we've not quite sorted out. You have agriculture I spoke about. But where there is a will, there is a way. And I hope we can harness that will. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you so much, DG Ngozi. And I think with that, we have our Q&A, and we had some pre-submitted questions. And I want to assure everybody that we'll try as much as possible to answer at least one of the pre-submitted questions. And after we're done with that, then we can address additional questions amongst all the esteemed guests that are here. I have questions from, I think, 2 esteemed guests, and I think Frank has questions from 3, and then we'll open it up to others. All of you are esteemed guests. I mean, I see Sister Flory here, who I'm sure you know, and there's so many esteemed guests here. And I think you talked about food insecurity, and it leads me, I think Gary Martin is a guest of Frank. Is Gary here? Because he had a question. I don't think Gary is coming virtually. Was he virtual?
I think he had to do virtual.
Okay. Alan, do you? I can read his commentary because he actually submitted a comment to you. He said the WTO. This is Gary, who is the president of North American Export Grain Association and International Grain Trade Coalition. He says the WTO Trade Cost Index background paper published in March 2021 shows that trade policy and regulatory differences play a significant role in pushing up the cost of trade, with the greatest impact in trade flows between lower income countries. Other high-ranking cost factors include transport and travel, governance quality, and ICT connectedness. This information is especially relevant to providing for food security. So it looks like he, sort of figured out ahead of time that that was a main issue, which we all know. WTO's 6th July 2021 trade dialogue on food was a pivotal United Nations Food Securities Systems Summit and related events. Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala's interventions have been truly important to communicate messages such as trade in food is not a luxury. He quotes you there, so you might decide if it's true or not. Right? And another quote is, 1 in every 6 people in the world depends almost entirely on international trade for the food they eat. That's another quote. It's statistics, which is now being widely quoted thanks to WTO. So that's a comment he made, and I don't think he's here. Frank, you said he's virtual. Yes. And the second, want to react to that commentary? Because okay.
Just to say that the concerns are real about costs. I was giving a talk on Nigeria the other day for a presidential retreat, and in looking at the numbers, I found that trade costs on the continent are equivalent to a 304% tariff, and in my country, Nigeria, 306%. So there's a lot of, which is double what it is in developed countries. So there's a lot of truth to this thing about trade costs, and if we could reduce that, that would have a very important impact on food. So there's absolutely, and then the issues of infrastructure. This is a very big part, along with regulatory red tape and other issues. So yes, we really need to pay attention for food import-dependent economies, for small island economies. These things matter very much, and there's a lot of work still to be done.
And so thanks for that. The next question is from Noreen Kennedy. Is she here? Is she virtual?
She's virtual.
Okay, wonderful. She's the Senior Vice President, Policy and Global Strategy, U.S. Council for International Business. And her question is this. There's a lot of pressure in the United States to link enforcement of core labor principles with trade using the USMCA as a baseline for trade agreements moving forward. The U.S. has brought this issue to the WTO, asking that forced labor safeguards be included in the fisheries subsidies negotiations. Members of U.S. Congress raised the bar this week, writing to U.S. Trade Representative Tai to urge strong worker protections as a top priority at the WTO, including creation of a WTO working group on worker rights. What do you see as the role of labor issues at the WTO, and where do you see synergies to advance a balanced approach that delivers both trade and worker benefits? That's her question.
Well, thank you. I always say that the WTO is about people, and labor is people. So I think the WTO is there to try and, as a purpose, try to deliver for people. That being said, with respect to labor rights and labor issues per se, this is a subject that is quite delicate at the WTO because there are members who are, I've not heard of any members who say that using forced labor, for instance, is something that is good to do. But there are members who are a little leery of this discussion in the sense that they're afraid that some forced labor, of course, as I said, and child labor, these are not things that should be countenanced. But there are other types of labor, for example, people working in people's households, relatives, and so on, that is tricky. And bringing those kinds of issues, people might feel, might be another way to, another, I don't know how to describe it, like some kind of non-tariff barrier, impinging on their exports. So there's a nervousness, if I want to put it that way. So that being said, I think we have to approach it carefully. We have to be very clear what we're trying to say, because many members feel that this issue belongs to the ILO. But I think if we approach this carefully, if we are very open and transparent about what we're talking about, I'm sure that many members would listen, but it's an issue that is extremely delicate at the WTO. So let's have a dialogue. Let's see how members can be approached on this issue. But I don't think it's one that you should approach with force, so as not to get a backlash on it. Let's approach it thoughtfully, carefully. Issues like what is the impact of this pandemic on the female labor force, for example. We're doing a study with the ILO jointly on this. I think taking issues where many members would be able to rally around and building trust that this is not something being used to really as a barrier to their trade. If we can build trust on some of these issues, maybe it is something that we can begin to work on. But like I said, it's controversial. Let's approach it carefully, but it's a very valid issue.
Thank you, Dr. Ngozi. And with that, I pass on to Frank.
Oh, sorry. Sorry, this is a question from Jennifer Hillman. Jennifer has had a distinguished career at USTR. She also served as a WTO appellate judge, so she's a recognized institution in Washington. Her question is, previous ministerials have succeeded in part because of deep engagement from both the United States and the business community. Are you seeing the kind of engagement needed to bring MC12 to a successful close? If not, what do you believe is behind the lack of engagement?
I'm getting really tough questions today. You know, every word you say for the WTO, you have to watch every single word and sentence. Engagement. I mean, I said to the business community, and I can share that with you, I think Jake is also here, that I would want them to be more engaged, that I was surprised they were not as engaged as I would have thought. But I'm beginning to see that kind of engagement. The ICC has been very active. We met with a group representing different services and sectors here not too long ago, about a couple of weeks. And I've met in Europe. I was at the Franco-German summit, which brings 30 top business people. President Macron called a business summit, over 200 top people. And I've been saying this. I'm glad to say that with the B20, the business group of the G20, we've been engaging. With the international chambers of commerce, we've been with all the chambers here in the US. So I think this will step up. I see an appetite to engage more. And they've told us what their issues are. With respect to members, you know, there's been a long period when these negotiations have been going on and some amount of, as I said, lack of trust, wondering whether, continuing this is still something that one would be, should be involved in. The dispute settlement system and other issues that were problematic to the U.S. may have also led to a feeling that maybe we don't engage as strongly. I'm happy to say Catherine Tai gave a speech yesterday, which I thought was laying out that the U.S. interest in WTO is still there, and the U.S. is willing to engage. So I hope with all of these signs of action, we see Europe engaging very strongly. I have to say Australia, New Zealand, we see the developing countries. African countries are really engaging. They want to see the WTO as an instrument that works for them, the Pacific, Caribbean. So I think we are beginning to see momentum that could lead us to an MC12 that would be interesting and that would be able to deliver one or two of the outcomes we're talking about. But we need to maintain that engagement. It's not just MC12. There's also post-MC12. There will be so many problems to solve that we cannot deal with at MC12. So we have to lay a path forward. So I think the challenge will be to keep that interest, to keep that level of engagement. And success breeds success. If we can have one or two exciting things that would happen, that would also let members know that, look, we can achieve together. And I think that would help keep the engagement level.
Great, thank you, Dr. Ngozi.
By the way, there's civil society too. We mustn't forget the importance of engaging civil society and explaining that the WTO is really about people. It's not an enemy, it's something that should deliver solutions. So I'm also interested, and we've been engaging with civil society and would like to continue to do that. They're a very important part of the equation.
Thank you very much, Doctor. The next question is from another Washington trade institution, Bill Wright, who is right here in front. He is now at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS. His question is the WTO equipped to deal with the challenges posed by non-market economies? If not, what needs to be done to address that?
I'm getting really easy questions today. At the beginning, I talked about the fact that we have some of our agreements that we really need to look at to see if they're still fit for purpose with respect to the economic environment and that we see today and the types of economies that we're dealing with in the membership, and to deal with the emerging issues we talked about with respect to all the subsidies across the board and the distortive impact. Is the WTO equipped? I think we need to look at our rules to make them fit for purpose. To do this, we have to actually get information on what those economies, what are the negative or positive spillovers from the types of policies that are being implemented. So it's the policy issues we need to look at. And I think that the work we've launched on competitive neutrality is the beginning of trying to gather some information on both the industrial subsidy side. We have a lot more on the agricultural subsidies, but not much. There are a lot of gaps. So let's try to put that information together. Let's see what the spillover effects are of some economies that are less market determined. And then let's try to tackle those. I mean, the membership of the WTO is what it is, but I think we can look at our instruments to see how do we deal with those policies coming from economies that have negative spillovers on others.
Thank you very much. Our last question is from Jake Colvin, who's president of the National Foreign Trade Council. He succeeded Rufus Zirkzee, who I'm sure you would know. His question is, what role do you see for the WTO in addressing supply chain problems? What can be done at the MC12 to set the table for
Thank you, Jake. I really think the supply chain issues are, you know, they're fascinating, and they come in several formats. We have those sets of issues to do with the medical manufacturing of medical products, the vaccines and so on, where we're working quite successfully with the manufacturers and helping to see what are the impediments from our members. What are the trade facilitating measures they need? What are the regulatory bottlenecks to be removed? What are the export restrictions and prohibitions we need to get rid of? So I'm trying to ease up the very complex supply chains of these manufacturers with 280 components manufactured at 18 sites in 19 countries for Pfizer and so on. Those are very interesting and going well. Then we come to the supply chain snarls that we're talking about today, which are posing a real problem. And I think we have to look back to what is at the base of this. I think in the beginning when the pandemic started, shipping and freight companies may have thought that the pandemic would depress economic activity, which it did, but they may have overcompensated by pulling out a lot of shipping and containers at that time, and containers are now in the wrong places. And now, with this fiscal stimulus that has been given, you have a lot of demand that is leading to these bottlenecks. So hot demand. On the business side, also a lot of demand, because there are businesses who are saying, oh, in order to make sure my supply chain, I don't get caught up in a problem, let me accumulate inventories now. And so this kind of demand push, coupled with the supply snafus that we have, is what is leading to this and, leading to inflationary pressures. So what can we do? We actually did do something. We try to reach out to the shipping companies to understand exactly the nature of the problems, because I tell you, if you think, that countries, coastal countries are having problems, can you imagine landlocked countries? Landlocked developing countries are seeing the costs of basic food items and products skyrocket. And many of them who are WTO members have come and said, what can we do? The same thing with small and medium enterprises who do not have the same kind of financial firepower to buy containers that have gone from $2,000 to $16,000. So we started to look into this to understand the nature of the problem. Before you can see what you can do, you have to understand the nature. And we started talking to to at least one of the shipping companies and trying to understand. They've actually, CCM of France, they've frozen their freight rates because they thought that abnormal profits were being garnered by the shipping companies. So we see these supply-demand mismatches that are causing this. And we know that over time, they'll probably straighten out. But the issue is, in the interim, is there anything that can be done to facilitate movement in the ports? Are there any red tape or other measures that members have put in place, or customs procedures that can be made easier so that goods can move quickly? Some of the other things, like lack of containers or the mismatches, I don't think there's much we can do. We have to leave those to the market forces to correct. But anywhere where members can make trade facilitation measures work, I think we can do something about that.
Great, thank you, Dr. Ngozi. We're over our time limit. I want to thank Dr. Ngozi for being here, for being such a wonderful guest, and for elaborating so much on what WTO is all about. Thank you, Dr. Ngozi. It's been a real honor to host you here.
And thank you very much for coming. Yes. And I think this is probably your first, have you had in person? How many have you had in DC? This might be your first. You've had
We had the World Bank,
Yeah, but
which
this is
was
your first,
hybrid.
yeah, this is the first one, so we're very grateful.
Okay.
Very,
You
very
say
good.
so.
I want to rub it in. This is the first.
Thank you.
Thank you again. We have some press. If we have time, if Dr. Ngozi has time, we'll be able to talk to the press, hopefully. Normally, we'd have cocktails and food for you, but if you go out this way, there are bags of food for all of you that you can enjoy just outside the building. So please join me in
To take photo with her.
some applause for Dr. Ngozi.
Thank you for having me.
So we're going to take a photo with you first. Can we stand and see how to do the photos?
Do you want to promote your business? Do you want to talk about your nonprofit organization? Do you want to talk about your culture? Introducing the online web TV, Afric Today. Fogham, where you can watch us live at the same time on 4 platforms: Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and using the Afric Today app. Download our app today for Android or Apple. Promote your business today. For more information, go to www.africtoday.com. Afric Today, the best of digital TV.